Welcome back to another edition of Force Friday, where we talk about Star Wars theories, characters, concepts, comparisons, analyzations, collectibles, and more. And today we're going to talk about this recent kind of drama surrounding Bob Iger from Disney and George Lucas in regard to Bob Iger's book. This is another topic that's kind of been skewed, misinterpreted, and misrepresented, probably to fit a YouTube algorithm because the drama gets the clicks. You dig? But perhaps we can look at it a little bit more objectively, examine their relationship, examine that deal, and talk about George Lucas as a writer and director in an objective manner while still remaining fans. But where do we begin? In my opinion, the best place is always the beginning. Bob and George, forgive my first name basis, but I feel like as much money as I spent with this franchise, I'm entitled to it. That and my opinions, and that's it. They first became acquainted in the 90s. At this time, Iger was running ABC. Lucas pitched the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and Iger was instrumental in getting that ball rolling. Despite a strong start, the numbers quickly plummeted, and at the time, it was believed that the show wouldn't get renewed for a second season. Why is this? Probably because the public expected a high adrenaline, high octane action adventure show, and Lucas wanted it to be educational, with Indy meeting several famous characters throughout history. ABC was very standoffish to this, but Iger supported George's vision and commissioned season 2, which also performed poorly. And ever since then, Lucas has been grateful to Iger for giving the show the chance he thought it deserved. Throughout their friendship and relationship, the idea of where Star Wars was going and who would eventually have ownership to it was discussed numerous times. And Lucas had made it clear that if he did decide to sell, he would go to Iger. And Iger knew how important Star Wars was to Lucas, and in a conversation at one point, Lucas even said, "When I die, my obituary will read Star Wars creator George Lucas." Eventually, Lucas reached out to Iger to sell the franchise. In his book, Iger says the worst thing you can do when negotiating is to falsely lead someone on until the purchase is complete. He stressed the importance of transparency and clarity, and that the issues mainly came down to how quickly they could make movies and still make them good. But clearly states the most difficult part of the negotiations involved George Lucas's creative power. George wanted to remain in full creative control after the sale. But while I understand the request, it's simply an unreasonable one. And this is just me speaking. You can't sell something to someone, especially when we're talking in the billions of dollars, and then expect that you can tell them how to run it. This actually closed negotiations at one point. But eventually, as we all know, they must have reopened, with Lucas phoning Iger and told him he had written outlines for the sequel trilogy and sent a copy to him. And then sent 2 other copies to 2 other top executives. Iger said, "I read George's outlines and decided we needed to buy them, though we made it clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot he had laid out." In 2012, there was a change to American capital gains laws, which meant that if George did not sell within 2012, he would have lost $500 million. This created the urgency to make George sell and be a little bit more open to compromises he may not have been before. George always knew that he would not have creative control. There was no wool pulled over his eyes. He eventually reluctantly agreed to be available to consult per request, and Iger promised that they would be open to his ideas. But much like his outlines, they would be under no obligation. Several months before the merger, George Lucas hires Kathleen Kennedy to run Lucasfilm and shepherd the new series. Iger says this was very sudden and apparently without any consultation to Disney. Lucas trusted Kennedy, and apparently her appointment made him feel more comfortable about the sale. He made it clear that Kennedy was to remain president should the deal come through. On October 30th, 2012, the deal was signed. Lucas oversaw the hiring of Michael Arndt as screenwriter and oversaw some concept art which featured a delusioned Luke in exile and a young female Force user who would find him. However, when Lucas had a meeting with Iger, Michael Arndt, J.J. Abrams, and Kathleen Kennedy at Skywalker Ranch to discuss the ideas of the sequel trilogy, Iger says George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him they weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiations. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. I've been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now, but I could have handled it better. I should have prepared him for the meeting with JJ and Michael and told him about our conversations, that we felt it was better to go in another direction. I could have talked through this with him and possibly avoided angering him by not surprising him, but George felt betrayed, and this led to the rocky start. Some people have suggested that this is because of some sort of Mickey Mouse money money grab. But the facts don't really line up with that. Iger talked about the then May 2015 release date, but stressed that he was firm this release date shouldn't be held at the expense of the film's quality. In particular, the move from May to December took the film's financial profits out of fiscal year 2015 and into fiscal year 2016, meaning Disney would take a financial dip in 15. He said that the most important thing was to release Star Wars movies that resonated with Star Wars fans, even if it meant taking a short-term hit, which lines up with Lucas's later comments that Disney, quote-unquote, wanted to make something for the fans. Over the course of 2015, George talked several times about the upcoming Episode 7, stating how he had no real involvement and that the films would not be using his outlines. But this was done for the sake of success. It was in Disney's interest to use George's scripts and fire full steam ahead. They chose not to, delaying their profits in order to appease a fan base. In December of 2015, George sat down with Charlie Rose for a 55-minute interview. This is probably the most often misquoted interview in history. They asked George how he felt about The Force Awakens. George said, well, I made the decision to sell the company, to sell Star Wars. I made the decision because I looked at the future. I noticed the last few movies that I had made were costing the company a lot of money, and I didn't think that was fair to the people that worked there or the company. And so I made the decision to move ahead on the next Star Wars series. Then they said, you as a director. He said, we were working with a writer, wasn't quite working out, but I was also stepping away a little bit and turning things over to Kathy Kennedy. And so what happened was Bob Iger said, gee, if you really want to sell your company, because we were talking about retirement, and what are you going to do after all this? And that started the ball rolling. I had the story treatments or outlines. We were working on scripts, and so I sold it. But I knew when I sold it, I said, I've tried to make movies where I step away. Empire and Return of the Jedi, and after about a couple weeks, I knew I couldn't do that. I had to stand over the shoulder of the director, help him, whisper in his ear constantly, no, do that, and be there to help guide it. And it was much harder than if I had directed it myself. J.J. Abrams, who is a good director and a good friend, and all those sorts of things, but he's also a top director with his own company. And Disney, who was a little nervous, they looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. So I said, all I wanted to do was tell the story of what happened. And it started here and it went there. So they decided they didn't want to use those stories. They said they were going to go do their own thing. And I decided, fine. They weren't that keen to have me involved anyway, but at the same time I said, if I get in there, I'm just going to cause trouble because they're not going to do what I want them to do. And I don't have the control to do that anymore. And all it would do is muck everything up. So I said, okay, I will go my way and I'll let them go their way. And it really does come down to a simple rule of life. When you break up with somebody, the first rule is no phone calls. The second rule, you don't go over to their house and drive by to see what they're doing. The third one is you don't show up in their coffee shop and say you're going to burn it. You just say, nope, gone, history, I'm moving forward. And from this interview, we know that Lucas knew there wasn't any smoke and mirrors. There wasn't any misconceptions. Lucas was well aware that they weren't going to be using his ideas. And they weren't looking for him to take control. They could be possibly interested in him as a consultant. Who wouldn't? But they were definitely trying to make their own film. Bob Iger's book continues to say, just prior to the global release, Kathy Kennedy screened The Force Awakens for George. He didn't hide his disappointment. There's nothing new, he said. There weren't enough visual or technical leaps forward. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't appreciating the pressure we were under to give fans a film that felt quintessentially Star Wars. We had intentionally created a world that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films to not stray too far from what people loved and expected. And George was criticizing us for the very thing we were trying to do. At the premiere, when asked about the film, he said, I can't review the movie. I think the fans are going to love it. It's very much the kind of movie they've been looking for. And we have to stop there for a minute. We have to stop there and really think about it. I think he's 100% right. It was my biggest criticism of The Force Awakens, that it was a lot more of doing Star Wars and not growing Star Wars. I had the same criticism about Solo, but I'd also say The Force Awakens was widely well received, which kind of goes to Lucas's point and mine, and contrary to the point of people who seem to think that Lucas is this big victim and Disney has ruined Star Wars and taken advantage of him. The fact is, if Lucas would have made these Star Wars movies, people probably wouldn't have liked them. Not nearly as much as they liked The Force Awakens, because Lucas wasn't really interested in fan service. But the creative team at Lucasfilm, along with Bob Iger, certainly were. They wanted to recapture the classic fan, because the general ether of the time was that the prequels had ruined Star Wars. Not the sequels, the prequels, which only gets turned on its head sometime later when prequel fans started saying that the sequels ruined Star Wars. It's almost like a generational thing. What you grow up with ends up being what you attach to and resenting the next wave to come. Thinking that George Lucas would have given you the Star Wars that you wanted is probably not accurate for the people that think Star Wars is ruined anyway. The fact of the matter is, the people that love the original trilogy and pretty much stand by it as their Bible, which I understand, give a lot more credit to George Lucas solely almost as the God overseer of Star Wars. And not not taking into account that Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back were developed by George Lucas and Gary Kurtz, who acted as a producer and was known to voice his opinions when he felt Lucas was wrong, which led him to leave the then in development Return of the Jedi when the original story plans were abandoned. He objected to a second Death Star, Ewoks, and he believed that Lucas was letting merchandise sway his story. In 2011, Kurtz said, "I could see where things were headed. The toy business began to drive the empire. It's a shame. They make 3 times as much on toys as they do on films. It's natural to make decisions that protect the toy business, but that's not the best thing for making quality films." George clashed with the Empire director Irvin Kershner, with the most famous example being the "I love you, I know" scene. Lucas was adamant that the original dialogue be used, but eventually yielded under fierce opposition from Kurtz and Ford. It's also been widely stated that George Lucas's wife was heavily involved in writing a lot of the dialogue on the first couple films, which do have a more human element than a lot of the dialogue in the prequel films, of which I'm also a fan, but I'm just being objective. Fast forward to the prequel era, which was largely criticized at the time, still fairly loathed by a fair swath of the Star Wars fandom who consider themselves original trilogy purists, was pretty much in complete and 100% creative control by the one and only George Lucas. Produced by Rick McCullum, who was often accused of being a yes man. Now, fast forward to the Clone Wars, which is much more widely adored. He collaborated with Dave Filoni. My point with this is not to take away from the greatness, the brilliance of George Lucas. My point is that it takes a village. That what Lucas does is push technology and world build. Along with that, he creates the mythology. But you need other people to come along and sort of fine-tune an idea into something great. For years, I've heard people criticize how much of a monster George Lucas is when it comes to destroying Star Wars. Until the next group of people get a hold of Star Wars, and now all of a sudden George Lucas becomes their savior. The same man that they were bashing and criticizing a decade prior has now become their knight in shining armor. So what would have George Lucas's trilogy look like? We don't know a whole lot. We know it was supposed to focus on very young characters, which supposedly made Disney very nervous as they were keen to avoid similar backlash faced by Phantom Menace Jake Lloyd and accusations of kidifying the franchise. We also know that Lucas's time with the art department for Episode 7 featured a very early version of Rey called Kira, described as a loner, hothead, gearhead badass, and Sam, described as pure charisma. Other ideas include the return of Anakin Skywalker in ghost form, Jedi hunters, Darth Vader's castle, and Kira finding a map to Luke Skywalker and the Jedi in hiding in the Emperor's Tower on the second Death Star sunken underwater. The idea of Ben Solo, then called Skylar, also came from Lucas, as did a very rough version of Snoke, or some sort of dark side figure who corrupted him. In an interview with James Cameron, Lucas said the next 3 Star Wars films were going to get into the microbiotic world. There's this world of creatures that operate differently than we do. I call them the Wills. And the Wills are the ones who actually control the universe. They feed off the Force. Elsewhere in the conversation, Lucas said everyone hated it in The Phantom Menace when we started talking about midichlorians. In terms of his storytelling, Lucas regarded individuals as vehicles for the Wills to travel around in, and the conduit is the midichlorians. The midichlorians are the ones that commute with the Wills. The Wills, in a general sense, they are the Force. Lucas said that had he kept his company, the Wills-focused films would have been done. Of course, a lot of the fans would have hated it, just like they did Phantom Menace, and everything, but at least the whole story from beginning to end would be told. So let's divert. The one thing that most people, including myself, who is a massive Star Wars fan and has often been accused of being a Star Wars apologist, tends to hate are the midichlorians, because they take the magic out of Star Wars. They rob children of sitting in a classroom and reaching for a pencil across the room with their hands stretched out, because now it doesn't seem like everyone can be a Jedi. Now you have to be born with a certain genetic aptitude for it. This is one of the reasons why I love The Last Jedi, because Luke's actions put hope and inspiration back into the universe, creating the faith and self-belief that you can do anything, including reach for a broom and have it snap into your hand reflexively. A microbiotic world of more scientific explanation for the magic in Star Wars does not sound like the sum that would appease the fans. In fact, it sounds like the very thing that fans would hate, especially original trilogy fans. Ironically, it's those same people that now jump to the defense of George Lucas, saying that Bob Iger has destroyed Star Wars and robbed poor old George Lucas of his master plan. Where was that same energy in 1999? Because I can tell you where it wasn't. It wasn't at the bars and restaurant tables that I was sitting at having to defend Phantom Menace, which I can tell you was no easy feat. I can understand Bob Iger's guilt, that perhaps he should have been more forthcoming and saying, look, we'll take it into consideration, but if we don't like it, we're not going to use it. Perhaps it was just vague enough for George Lucas to believe that even though he was told they would take it into consideration, that it was pretty much a given. So I can understand the guilt there, especially when there's this history and years upon years of friendship backing it. But the truth is, George Lucas is a grown man. Bob Iger is a grown man. And they made a business decision where George Lucas walked away with $4 billion that he didn't need and got rid of most of it to charities pretty much instantly. It's not about the money. It's never been about the money. For George, it's always been about creative control. But you can't sell something for $4 billion and expect creative control, especially when your history regarding creative control, when you have unlimited power, is at the very least up for debate in terms of its quality. 1, 2, and 3 are not 4 and 5. 6 is not 4 and 5 because 4 and 5 had a group of people working on it. 1, 2, and 3 was one maniac. A maniac that's an inspiration to me. A maniac that's a hero to me. A maniac that turned his finger up to the entire movie making industry and did what he wanted to do and deserves the respect for that until the day he dies, let alone creating the mythology that has stuck around for 40 some years. But a maniac nonetheless. People look at George Lucas with rose-colored glasses when it suits their commentary, but not when it suits the facts. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.